Thank you. Thank you, Brad, and it really is a pleasure to be here and to address you guys. I'm a little jealous of all of you for being able to go through the Lyceum program. It sounds so amazing, and I think you're really lucky to be part of this. Eat it up, make the most of it. It's a once-in-a-lifetime kind of opportunity. Now, I also know that all of you are here because he made you come. And I get that, because I'm not sure all of you would be here if not for that. I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is far away. It's even not that much in the news anymore over the last few weeks. It's a distant conflict. People from, you have not met, although you might meet some of them here and there, but what relevance is it to you? You live in South Carolina, life's pretty good here. We've got our own political problems. We've got our own challenges. Why should you care what happens on the other side of the world? Why should you care about a conflict which has, as you'll hear lots of people tell you, 2,000 years at least of history? These people have been fighting each other. How do you make heads or tails or any sense of what is going on over there? I mean, isn't it easier just to blank out, ignore it, live your lives, and not care? And I'm here to tell you, you should care. And I think as Lyceum scholars in particular, you should care for two reasons. I mean, many reasons, but I'm focused on two. The first, as I hope I will be able to show you today, is because this is an issue of good versus evil. And as participants in a program about morality, about ethics, about moral character, good and evil are important. Good and evil are fundamental concepts, fundamental ideas out there. And it's important to know what good is and to know what evil is, to be able to identify good and maybe even support it. Your life might depend on your ability to support good, and to avoid evil and to fight it, but certainly to stay away from it. The conflict in the Middle East is a conflict of good versus evil in a real sense. And it's relevant to you because of that. And it's good versus evil in a particular context, which again I think is particularly relevant for Lyceum scholars. This is a conflict about and centered on the nature and essence of civilization. It is, in many respects, a conflict about Western civilization. And again, much of what you study here is the Western civilization, the core of Western civilization, the ideas behind and at the foundation of Western civilization. And I think the conflict there is, in essence, a conflict between Western civilization and those who oppose it. And here I would expand the conflict to not just what's going on over there, but everybody's response to it is very much a question of your attitude and your perspective about Western civilization, about civilization more broadly. So let's talk about these two ideas. So first, how can I say it's good versus evil? What is good? What is evil? And how can you tell when, again, these two parties have been in conflict with one another forever, really? Or certainly since, the last 100 years, 150 years? Isn't it complicated? Isn't it complex? Isn't there some good and some bad in each side of them? Why this black and white attitude? And how much history do you have to know in order to make an evaluation? How can you figure this out? How can you tell who the good guys are and who the bad guys are? I mean, this is a generalizable question for much in your life. How can you tell who the good guys are? How can you tell who the bad guys are in political science, in the political world out there? Well, what is good? What does it mean to be good? Well, in my view, to be good is to be pro-human life. The good is that which promotes, aids, facilitates the flourishing of human beings. It's ideas that do that, political systems that do that, cultures that do that, civilizations that do that. They are good. Where human beings can flourish, when human beings can be successful. Those are generally good. And, there's some that are better and some that are really, really good, right? One could argue, America, certainly in the post-Civil War period, was about the best we've ever had in terms of the facilitating human flourishing. What is evil? Evil that is anti-life, anti-human flourishing, anti the ability of individuals to live their lives as they see fit based on their values. It's the suppression of that, the oppression of that, the destruction of that. That is evil. Evil is anti-human life. Well, how does this apply to the current conflict, and how can we make sense of it? Well, I think the first thing to do is just look at the kind of cultures that Israel has created and that the Palestinians have created in order to see which one of them is pro-life and is one of them anti-life. Is there really good and evil here? And we can start with Israel. Israel, for those of you who have not been and do not know, Israel is basically a country that in many respects is similar to the world in which we live here in the United States. People are treated as individuals. People are treated with equality before the law. And surprisingly, to many people, I think, who have never been there, that is true no matter what their religion is, no matter what their ethnic origin is. They're treated equally before the law. They are Muslim Arabs who serve in the Israeli parliament, who have served in the Israeli government, who serve, if they choose to, in the Israeli military. Property rights are respected. Now, property rights are respected. People are treated equally before the law. Mostly, right? There's always going to be exceptions. There's always going to be horror stories, just like they are here. Just like they are in any Western country. There are going to be injustices. But for the most part, as a principle, as the ruling principle in Israel, people are left alone to live their lives. They're protected by the government. The government does its job in protecting your rights. And as such, Israel is a flourishing country. I go back every year or every couple of years, and it astounds me how much building there is, and how much productivity there is, and how much added value, how much flourishing there is. How much people have the opportunity to really enjoy and thrive in their lives. Israel has fought many wars, but if you go across the wars, they are almost always, the actions that they take can be easily linked to self-defense. You're attacked, you defend yourself. Again, I'm sure somebody can find something that Israel has done militarily that is no good, that is wrong. But as a rule, the actions are taken in self-defense, as appropriate for a government that is protecting its citizens. But, people are treated there as human beings, and they flourish. If you're different in some way in Israeli society, you're treated equally as everybody else. Think about people of different skin colors. I know everybody assumes that Israel is monolithic when it comes to, let's say, skin color, but that's not true. There are Jews who come from Yemen or Ethiopia who are quite dark-skinned. There are ones like me who are pretty fair-skinned. And again, is there discrimination? Sure, just like there is in every culture to some extent. But as a rule, and before the law, there is none. If you're gay, nobody cares. The government certainly doesn't care. Israel is a Western country with all the benefits that we have in the West in terms of our ability to be successful as individuals. And with, unfortunately, all the flaws that we have in the modern West, with too much government, too many regulations, too many controls, too many taxes, too many of those things. But those are trivial as compared to the amount of freedom and the amount of liberty you have. And particularly trivial when you compare. Because who's on the other side of that? The other side of that is Palestinian society, Palestinian culture, which in every one of those respects is the opposite. If you're an Arab in Israel, you are treated as an equal. But a Jew cannot live among Palestinians. In 2005, Israel decided to leave the Gaza Strip. Unilaterally, just leave. Up until then, Israel had been occupying the territory it had captured during the 1967 war, a war of self-defense. At that time, before that, the Gaza Strip was part of Egypt, and Egypt was threatening Israel with a war. Israel ultimately took the Sinai and it took Gaza. And when they cut a peace deal with the Egyptians said, we don't want Gaza. You can keep it. And Israel reluctantly kept it. And it actually settled people. There were actually little villages inside Gaza with Jews in them, right, who lived there. Israelis lived there. And in 2005, Israel had had enough. There'd been a lot of terrorist attacks. The early 2000s were a period called the Second Intifada, where there had been lots of terrorist attacks against Israelis, and particularly in Gaza, and particularly from Gazans coming into Israel. And Israel said, we're just going to leave, and we're going to leave you alone. And they did. They evacuated the place. But when the military left, they forcefully took out all the Israeli settlers who had settled in Gaza. They said, look, we can't protect you because we're leaving. And we know exactly what's going to happen to you if you stay. You're going to be killed. Not discriminated against, not treated badly, you're going to die. So we're going to actually take you out. There are lots of photos of these people dragged from their homes. They wanted to stay. They had built something there. They were connected to this place that they had built and created. They'd also, for example, built industry. There were these little factories. There were this machinery. There were what do you call the agriculture where. Yeah, there were these beautiful modern greenhouses, really sophisticated greenhouses. And they left them. They figured the Palestinians would use them. The day after they left, the Palestinians went in and destroyed all the greenhouses, destroyed all the factories, destroyed all the equipment. They could have used them. They could have to make their own lives better. But no, they wanted to touch nothing that had to do with an Israeli, that Israel had done. They were committed to destruction. From 2005 until October 7th, 2023, the Palestinians received in Gaza billions and billions and billions of dollars of aid. The whole world was sending them money. The United States, the Europeans, the Qataris, the Egyptians, the Saudis, everybody sent them aid, billions and billions and billions of dollars. They could have built a magnificent city on the Mediterranean. It's a lovely area. It's deserty, but you've got beautiful beaches on the Mediterranean. You could have made, with the kind of money that they had rolling in, they could have built anything they wanted to. They didn't. They built tunnels, they built weapons, they built equipment for war. They had no interest in the furtherance of the life of their own citizens. If you disagreed with the rulers of the Gaza Strip, Hamas, who became the rulers through a little civil war with the other Palestinian factions, you were killed. If you were gay, you were killed. If you were suspected of being maybe associated with the Israelis in some way, you were killed. They just executed a bunch of people in Gaza recently because they suspected them of being Israeli agents. No trial, no process, bullet in the head, and you're done. They built nothing, they've created nothing other than tunnels and weapon systems dedicated to the destruction and killing of Israel. No matter what the history is, they have shown themselves to be anti their own people, anti their own. They have not facilitated human flourishing. They have not facilitated human growth, quite the contrary, but human destruction, human death. And then, of course, I don't want to, express all the stories coming out of October 7th. You've probably heard some of them. But then the sheer acts of barbarism that they engaged in on October 7th. The rape, the torture, the murder. Barbarism, a hatred of human life, and a pride in it. They were filming everything. They called up their parents and gloated about the fact that they had killed some Jews. They weren't hiding this. They wanted everybody in the world to know that they were rapists, murderers, torturers. Otherwise, why upload it to social media? This is a culture of death and destruction and darkness. It is a culture that is the exact opposite of a culture of life. And that's why I say it's evil. It's evil because it's pro-death, pro-destruction, pro-force. And I say Israel is good, and believe me, there's nobody, I don't know anybody who's more critical of Israel on a lot of different issues than me. But fundamentally, Israel's a good country. Just like I say, as much as I hate Democrats, I hate Republicans, I hate everything about politics in America, but America is a good country. It's an amazing country. It's got lots of flaws, and yet it's fundamentally good. Why is it fundamentally good? Because fundamentally, it's pro-individual flourishing. It's pro-human life. It makes mistakes, it does stupid things, but fundamentally at the core, this country is still the land of opportunity, and in a significant sense, Israel is similar. These are good countries. And yet, there is barbarism in the world. It's sad. It used to be, by the way, that the whole world was barbaric. It's not that long ago that Europeans were slaughtering each other, raping, pillaging, torturing each other, just like Hamas did to the Israelis. It wasn't that long ago. If you go back to the 30-Year War, you read stories about the 30-Year War, what Protestants did to Catholics, and Catholics did to Protestants, is unthinkable today. It was so horrific. Something like 40% of the entire German population was killed by Germans in the 30-Year War, right? Catholics and Protestants slaughtering each other. Now it's unthinkable. And that's what makes us civilized. That shows the progress from barbarism to civilization, is the fact that we now believe that's unthinkable. Well, Hamas, sadly, that culture is still 500 years behind. For them, it's not unthinkable. For them, it's completely reasonable to rape, torture, murder your enemy, and to not bring civilization to your own people, to not embrace individual liberty, individual freedom, prosperity, human flourishing. They reject that. Israel is fundamentally, again, with all its flaws, an individualistic culture. Hamas is completely collectivistic. It's about membership of the group. The individual doesn't matter. No individual benefited from all those tunnels and all those weapons and all that murder and all that rape. It doesn't actually benefit the individual. So there is clearly good and evil, and October 7th made it very, very real. So There are good guys and bad guys in this world. And you can figure that out by watching how they behave, what values they pursue, what they think is important in life, and what they don't. You can judge. I know it's not popular in the world in which we live to judge. But judging is part of life. You have to decide who your friend's going to be, who you want to associate with, and who you want to keep your distance from. And life is going to be better if you surround yourself with people who are good. Good for you, good to you, good with you. And distance yourself from people who are bad, who do you damage, who pursue values that are destructive to your own life. And that is true in politics as well. Global geopolitics. Stay away from people who are destructive. Destructive to their own people, never mind to you. They might not fly over here, although they have. You know, we can do our direct link from ideologically, certainly, culturally, certainly, from Hamas to Al-Qaeda and to 9/11. These are not two completely distinct groups. You know, nobody talks about the fact, or almost nobody talks about the fact that Hamas is an Islamist group. It is dedicated to Sharia law. It's dedicated to bringing Sharia law on a global scale to the entire world. It is an authoritarian regime, an authoritarian ideology that believes in world domination. That sounds weird. You don't hear about world domination outside of James Bond movies. But they believe it. So there is no difference between Hamas and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all these groups. It's not the case that all Muslims agree with that. The majority of Muslims do not. But the ones who do are dangerous. Dangerous to you, to your life, to our values, to our system to our way of life, to our system of government, to everything about us that is good. They are hostile to it. And that needs to be recognized. You need to know that. And you need to be able to judge it, even if saying something's evil is politically incorrect in the world in which we live. That is suicide. Part of living is to identify what is bad and stay away from it. And fight it if it's necessary. Destroy it if you have to. But I think there's even bigger relevance to your life and a bigger issue here, and that is this issue of really a battle that's going on, I think, in the world over Western civilization. What does it mean to be civilized? And what are the values that we in the West, and when I talk about the West, I talk about a set of ideas. The West to me is a set of ideas. There are lots of countries today that are in the East that are really Western countries. I consider South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan as Western countries. What is it that makes the West the West? It's not ethnicity. It's not location. It's not geography. What makes the West is a set of ideas. The kind of ideas you guys are learning, studying, engaging with. And the set of ideas that basically changed the West, it came from Europe and changed the West, a set of ideas that basically makes that what happened in the 30-year war is truly unacceptable. It comes out of the 30-year war. Indeed, much of it is a rebellion against the horrors of the 30-year war and the 100-year war and all the other wars in Europe where people slaughtered each other. And these ideas of enlightenment, ideas around the value of the individual, the value of the individual's mind, the idea that knowledge, truth comes from a faculty of reason. It's not implanted in us. It's something we need to discover. And reason is a means of knowing the world. It's the scientific revolution, which is a reason revolution. And it's an idea that only individuals can reason. And if individuals can reason, What does that mean? What's the political implication of the fact that only individuals can reason, and that they can indeed reason, that they have this faculty, they can actually discover truth? Is there political implication to the fact that each one of you as an individual can discover truth? I mean, the political implication is America. 300 years ago, could you decide what profession to go after? No. That was all determined by others. Men, you got to do what your father did. Join the same guild as he did. If you're a woman, sorry, profession? You got to be kidding me. Could you decide who to marry? In some cases. Many cases, no. Again, somebody else told you. The idea that each one of us is capable of truth means that each one of us is capable of actually taking care of yourself, making decisions for yourself, pursuing your own individual values. Which means I get to choose my career. It means I get to choose who to marry. It means I get to choose who my political leadership should be. Suddenly, people are liberated. The human mind is liberated. The individual is liberated. And suddenly we come to value individuals as individuals. And we abandon the barbarism of the past. And we embrace liberty, freedom, individual rights. These are all concepts that come out of that period. And these are all concepts that make the West, make civilization, civilization. So being able to identify those values is incredibly important, particularly in an era like we're living today, where these values are clearly under attack. And they're not just under attack from Hamas or many others in the Middle East who are clearly antagonistic to any sense of reason. You don't get to make your decisions. They're all written in a book. Allah tells you what to do. You just follow orders. They're not just about the fact that you can't pursue your own ideas. I mean, we talked about women 300 years ago. Well, in Gaza, women are still treated today the way they were 300 years ago. Think about Afghanistan these days, where Islamists, the same basic ideology, a woman cannot go to school, cannot reveal her face, her body, any part of her, black from top to bottom, eyes, maybe, see a slit with eyes. This is barbarism, and we need to call it that. This is everything antagonistic to what Western civilization, what civilization is. But it's also right here in our universities. Maybe not at Clemson, I don't know. But think about all those student demonstrators who are out there supporting Hamas, Queers for Palestine. What do they do to queers in Palestine? They throw you off a tall building. And I'm not exaggerating. It's happened. And it happens all the time. Barbarism. Think of all those students willing to violate the rules of their school, willing to risk being expelled from their school in order to fight for what cause? What cause are they fighting for? For the cause of barbarism, for the cause of murder and rape and torture. They're fighting for evil. And by implication, they're fighting against Western civ. They're fighting against civilization. They're fighting against the values that make this country what it is, that make the world in which we want to live what it is. But there's one thing worse than the student demonstrators. What's worse than the student demonstrators? The professors who teach them. Because the students are just playing out what they've been taught. And what they've been taught is an ideology. There's an antagonistic to the very nature of our world. They've been taught an ideology that says, yes, you can tell who's good and evil. You know how you can tell who's good and evil? If you're successful, if you've done well in life, if you're happy, maybe even you're wealthy, then you must be evil. Then you must be bad. The only way, by the way, according to them, to be happy, to be successful, to be rich, to do well in life, is by exploiting other people. They are the exploiters. And they are the bad guys. And how do we know who's good? If you're poor, if you're unsuccessful, you're unhappy, if you've not done well in life, if you struggle, then you are virtuous. Then you are the good. I mean, they have a name for this. It's called intersectionality, where they actually can rank you based on how many places in which you are suffering and you are bad. And that makes you more virtuous. The more you have these bad things happen to you, the more virtuous you become. There's an entire ideology that comes out of certain moral roots in the West that says that the meeker, the poorer, the more struggling you are, the more virtuous you are. And therefore, we need to penalize the successful and benefit the weak. We need to do this throughout all of society. We need equity. We need ultimately equality of outcome. How does this apply to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? It's pretty simple. Israel is rich, relatively speaking, successful, people there pretty happy. Well, they must be the bad guys. They must be the guy. How did they do that? They must have exploited other people. Who have they exploited? Well, it's obvious. The Palestinians, because they're poor, they're miserable, they're angry, they're unhappy. There you go. They must be the virtuous. We live in a culture where a lot of what we're taught is be suspicious of success, be suspicious of the good, of people who flourish, and embrace those who struggle. Because they're struggling, don't look too deeply into why they're struggling. Don't ask that question. And therefore the Palestinians immediately become the good guys. Israel immediately becomes the bad guys. And all these students who go into the demonstrations are just playing out what their professors have just taught them. They're playing out a moral system, an ethical system that dominates many of our universities, particularly the Ivy Leagues. But it's a philosophy and ideology that is exactly counter to the ideas that made this country, the West, successful and prosperous. We are not a culture of equality of outcome. We're actually a culture of justice. I like to use their terms. Of social justice. I consider social justice to be you get, in a social context, what you deserve. You produce a lot, you get rich. You don't produce a lot, for whatever reason, you might choose not to produce a lot, which is fine. You have less impact on the world out there, you don't become rich. That's justice. Right? I mean, some of us choose to be teachers because we don't care that much about money. Right, Brett? Correct. We know we'll never be rich. You can't be rich as a teacher. And to a large extent, because the impact you have on just sheer numbers is going to be limited. Apple has a massive impact on gazillions of people. They make a lot of money. It's economic justice. So what is being played out on our campuses is a real struggle over what we're about. Are we about equality of outcome? Are we about pulling down the successful, destroying the able, all in the name of some mythological equality out there? Or are we about individual flourishing? Leaving individuals free, leaving individuals to pursue their own values, to make something of their own life. And the inequality that results from that is a feature. It's not a bug. It's part of what life is about. Take any group of people, put them on a desert island, and come back 2 years later, they're not going to be equal. For a variety of reasons, they're all going to be different. Some of them will fish, some of them will be farmers, some of them will build huts, some of them will be lazy, some of them will work hard. And there'll be different outcomes, because we are different, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing. So, the struggle in Israel or in the Middle East today is a struggle about these ideas, these values. Now, it's true, Hamas has no interest in egalitarian ideology at Harvard. But the egalitarians in Harvard have aligned themselves with Hamas in an anti-Western civilization coalition, if you will. They hate or they reject the ideas that made this country great, the ideas of individualism, reason, individual rights, economic freedom, economic liberty. So what's happening over there is coming right into our campuses. It's right here. How we evaluate what's happening over there is affecting what's happening in our own lives, in our own world. And it's important to have a position on it. It's important to figure it out and to know what's going on and what is at stake. And as I said, I think at stake is the kind of world we want to live in. The kind of world we want to live in. A world of Sharia law or egalitarianism or any variation in between. We can put Putin's Russia in there as well as another variation on the theme. Or do we want to live in a world which is fundamentally free? A world which is fundamentally about individual liberty. A world which encourages you as individuals to find your own path in life and to achieve your own individual flourishing and to make something of your own life, knowing that you're all going to be different and all going to have different outcomes. It's a choice between authoritarianism and freedom. And ultimately, it's a choice between barbarism and civilization. And it's a choice we all have to make, in a sense, every single day as political beings. Thank you.
Thank you, Yaron. When I was on Yaron's podcast today, I spent a great deal of time bragging on all of you to his audience. And I told Yaron that you guys are really smart, and that you're tough, and that you'll ask really hard questions.
Expectations are very low. Yeah. Don't worry.
So, anyway, I have high expectations for all of you to ask really good questions.
And let me just add, I mean, it would be great if the first few questions were on this issue, but if you want to ask questions beyond this, I know maybe somebody wants to ask a question about economics, feel free to ask about anything you want to ask. Yes?
Hi, I'm Charlotte Cross, and I'm a senior here at the Lyceum program. And I was wondering if you could clarify your thesis for me, because at first you started the talk talking about Israel versus Palestine, but then you broadened it to Egypt and Afghanistan and then to Sharia law. So is the war really more about like Judeo-Christian principles versus Islam, or what is your stance there?
Yeah, good question. No. I think the war is between, again, civilization and barbarism. Now, it takes, in the Middle East, barbarism takes a particular form. And that form is not Islam, it's Islamism. So it's a particular interpretation of Islam, quite a popular interpretation of Islam, but a particular interpretation of Islam. And that interpretation of Islam is that everything in life should be governed by Islam. That is, whereas in Christianity early on, there was a certain separation between state, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and God what is God. There's a certain separation of state and church. In Islam, at least in the Islamist version, there's no separation. So everything is guided by that. And I call them Islamists, you can call them Islamic totalitarianists, Islamo-fascists, there are a lot of variations. That is an ideology. I consider most conflicts in the world, most conflicts generally, to be ideological conflicts. I think what drives history is our ideas, philosophy. They hold a particular idea. Now, I think today, who represents Islamism? Certainly Hamas, and many in the Palestinians. Afghanistan. I do not think Egypt, although Egypt flirts with it. Right now, Egypt is ruled by basically a military dictator. But when they had free elections, the Muslim Brotherhood won, and the Muslim Brotherhood are an Islamist organization that would hold the same ideas. So this is a battle happening within the Muslim world. Do we want to be Islamists, or do we want a more moderate, let's call it moderate version of Islam? Do we want a separation of state and church, for example? You're seeing that play out right now in Syria. Syria was just taken over by, there's been a civil war in Syria forever. The ruler of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, was deposed just a few weeks ago. There's a new group in charge. They are explicitly Islamists. They want Sharia law to dominate. They don't want women to get an education. They don't want, so when the foreign minister of France or Germany came to visit, the ruler of Syria would not shake her hand because she was a woman, right? So they're Islamists. So that set of ideas, which is now, one extent or another, pretty dominant in the Middle East, that is the enemy, right? And then what is it opposed against? I do not like to call it Judeo-Christian. That gives way too much credit to religion. I think what makes, and I know I'll offend a few people, but that's okay, that's why I'm here. What makes the West great is that it rejected the dominance of religion. The Enlightenment was basically an era that said, religion, keep that at home. Well, in the public sphere, what guides us is reason. The way we discover truth, through science, through scientific inquiry, that's reason. The way we're going to establish political institutions and figure out, like, how to structure our politics, reason. I mean, read Jefferson, right? The way America is structured, I don't consider that a consequence of Judeo-Christianity. I consider that, in a sense, the consequence of the embrace of reason and the sidelining of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So I think what you've got a conflict of here is Islamism versus a civilization built on the idea of reason and individualism, and therefore freedom, liberty. That is the conflict. And that's why not only will I throw in, Islamism, I also consider, I don't know, let's see, I consider the professors at Harvard as part of the anti-individualism reason world. I consider Putin part of the anti-freedom individualism world, reason world, right? So civilization, Western civilization has lots of enemies. Islamism is one of them. And indeed, we breed many of the enemies. Communism is an enemy. Fascism is an enemy. And of course, we bred those within the West. So again, it's not about geography. It's about ideas. It's about reason, individualism, political liberty versus authoritarianism, mysticism, and a rejection of the individual in the name of collectivism. That is the fundamental conflict in the world today, and in a sense, it's the fundamental philosophical conflict we live in. And Israel is just one manifestation of it. Yeah.
So, to a degree, both based on.
Okay, I liked what she did, right? She introduced herself and told me what year and her name. That was phenomenal. So why don't we make that a habit?
Sounds good.
All right.
My name is Brian Turner. I am a freshman.
Thank you, Brian.
In the Lyceum program. And to a degree, despite the fact that I would say, as you're saying, that a lot of part of American culture, Western civilization in general, has started to shift away from that sense of religion-based foundations, I would say it's hard to argue that, at least in Western civilization, Christianity has not had a significant impact on the way our governments and politics are observed, or at least the lenses through which they have that sort of perception. And so, to a degree, a large part of biblical tenets, my understanding, is that the concept of the meek and the weak and the last shall be first. That sense of the first shall be last, the last shall be first is fairly pervasive throughout most of the readings of like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Do you think to that end, and perhaps to other ones off of your previous point, that degree to which Christianity has started to outgrow its usefulness or its applicability within Western civilization, or perhaps just American culture in general? Or is there a way to unify the sense of individualist progress and how one governs themselves while also remaining along those lines of being meek, being humble, being lesser than?
All right, great question, and one that's going to get me in trouble. But the truth is the truth. Look, I think you've identified something really, really important here. Now, I'm going to disagree a little bit with your opening, but we'll get to that in a minute. I think this issue that Christianity takes on of the meek, the last should be first, all of that, is behind, at the end of the day, behind much of modern egalitarianism. Christianity has always, in its history, always flirted with the kind of communism, kind of equality of outcome. There have always been sects and splinters and spin-offs that invented communism way before. I mean, communism has always been around, but Christianity had a whole thread of people who take those ideas seriously, because certainly the Pope never took those ideas seriously. Think about how he lived. Think of the glamour and he never thought of the last should be first. He was first, and he was rich. So Christianity's always had this idea of the meek shall inherit the earth, and I think that the modern left, in that sense, is cribbing off of Christianity. They're taking it from there. And I don't think it's just the modern left. I think Marx took it from Christianity. I think much of the kind of leftist agenda, the socialist agenda, is a secularization of those Christian ideas. So in that sense, to the extent that you interpret Christianity as taking seriously this idea of the meek shall inherit the earth, and the last should be first, and the first should be last, they are emboldening the enemies, I think, of what Western civilization is. That is anti the kind of merit-based, economic justice approach that capitalism promotes. Capitalism does not hold that the first should be last and the last should be first. That's not capitalism. You build it, you create it, you keep it, you're first, right? If you get to be first. And if you're not, you're not. So I think that, Christianity has been incredibly influential on everything in the West. But maybe its biggest influence, I'd say, over the last 200 and something years has been on really defining a secular left, which takes Christian ethics and Christian morality really, really seriously and implements it politically. And I think that is socialism. And if you read the Sermon on the Mount, I think there's a lot of socialism there. Now, granted, we were talking about this, in religious books, you can find whatever you want to find. If you're a capitalist and you approach religious books, you will find capitalism there. If you have a particular approach to anything and you look at a religious book, and this is true of any religious book, you'll find what you want to find in it. It's part of the nature of religion, and it's part of the intent of the authors of these books. They want to build big coalitions. They don't want to alienate people. So, and then you said that Western civilization is to a large extent based on Christian ideas, on the Judeo-Christian, that it's inspired by it. Now, it's true, Christianity's in the background. Christianity's everywhere, right? It is the culture, it is the dominant culture in every place where these ideas come from. But at the end of the day, in every sense that civilization took a step forward, it took a step forward by rejecting something from religion. It says, no, the way to learn about the natural world is through observation, experimentation, science, the process of scientific discovery, not studying ancient books. You don't discover truth about the natural world by studying ancient books, which was the way in which we discovered for 1,000 years. No, it's about looking into the world. It's about using your reason in the world. It's not about faith, it's about reason. We all have this capacity to discover truth, because truth is the relationship between our consciousness, our reason, and the real world, factual reality. Right? It's not about what's written in a book. It's not about somebody who claims the truth was revealed to them. It's not about revelation. It's about discovery. It's about a process. So there is a sense in which every single one of these advances is a rejection of at least a piece of religion. Now, it's true they never rejected religion completely, certainly not the founders and not many of the people who, Newton and so on. They all kept religion. But in the areas in which they advanced are the areas in which they put religion to the side. So, is Christianity, what was your question in the end? Outlived its purpose for?
Also, is it in direct conflict with the furthering of Western civilization?
Yes. I mean, religion has outlived its purpose. Religion was and is a way to explain the world. And you don't have to agree with me, and you're not going to, but that's fine. You're here to be exposed to new ideas and to different ideas. I don't expect anybody to be convinced by my 5-minute explanation. Religion was a way to explain the world. We didn't know what determined the tides of the river and the tides of the sea. We didn't understand the sun and the stars. So there was a god of the river and a god of this and a god of that. Everything we didn't understand, we named a god after it. And then we got more sophisticated and we said, you know, we keep understanding more and more stuff. So it doesn't really make sense to have a god for each one of these things. Let's have one god, kind of a bucket. We put into that bucket everything we don't understand, we'll put into that bucket. And then at some point, we discovered even those other things that we thought we didn't understand, we can understand. And we can understand more and more and more and more. And we grew in our ability to understand reality constantly. And as we grew, the bucket shrunk. And at some point you have to say, look, we have the tool to understand the world. We have the tools to even establish morality, ethics, which is kind of the last bastion of religion in my view, right? Religion's given up on trying to explain the physical world. They've left that to science. That's okay, we're not going to do that. So now we hold the monopoly over morality. Well, do you? Can we explain morality from a secular perspective without God? Can we justify goodness without God? I would say yes, you can. So what do we need it for exactly, again? So I think it's outlived its purpose, yes. It had a purpose. We're too smart to need it anymore. Sorry. Yeah.
Dr. Brook, thank you. My name is Thaddeus Martin. I'm a junior here in the Lyceum program. Just to back away from the religion topic a little bit.
Good. Although I love the topic. I think it's great.
I think maybe a more favorable, if less accurate view of a lot of the protests regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict is that Israel is fighting less of a war and more, a lot of people have called it a genocide, that they are
Yep.
just wholesale human slaughter of people
Yep.
who have different ideals. And then on another note, you talked about how there's a lot of these Eastern countries which have Western ideals, and those change very rapidly. I mean, you said you've counted Japan, South Korea, Singapore among these countries, and those changes occur within 10 years or less than that. So I guess it's sort of a two-part. First of all, do you think that's what Israel is doing? And secondly, is it possible for Hamas, or maybe not necessarily the organization
To change.
itself, but the Palestinians that are living there,
Yep.
to have a similar change of culture, change of ideals like the Japanese and the Koreans?
Yeah, great question. So first, I mean, I don't know how you can imagine that what is happening in Gaza is a genocide. I mean, let's put numbers to it. We're talking about an area, a tiny little area, probably the county here is probably the size of Gaza, in which 2 million people live. 2 million people live. Israel has occupied most of that territory. In urban warfare, it is killed by Palestinian estimates, and they include people who die of natural causes. They include a bunch of different things, but they've estimated 48,000 people have died. By all estimates, at least 20 of those are combatants, Hamas militants with weapons in their hands who died. So 28,000 civilians have died. I mean, it's a big number, right? But for 2 million people in a small area, urban combat, that is the smallest ratio of civilians to military personnel killed probably in human history, but it's certainly since we've held records, right? If Israel had fought the war in Gaza like the Americans fought in Mosul in Iraq, which was also a densely populated, there would be 5 times more civilians that would have died. Right? And that's America, who places a huge value on civilian lives and tries not to kill them. So what's happening in Israel is not genocide. It's Israeli suicide. Because the consequence of fighting a war like this where you don't kill anybody, or you kill very, very few people, is you can't win. And Israel's lost this war. It hasn't won this war. It's destroyed their homes, but they're all still there. They all still hate Israel as much. They do October 7th like this again, if they want it, if they had the ability to do it. And Israel knows that. So nothing is being gained, but genocide? I mean, genocide is where you wholeheartedly slaughter everybody. Israel lets people know before they bomb a building so they can evacuate it. They have multiple levels of approval for every single bomb that is dropped. They are so careful not to kill civilians. And the consequences are that very few civilians have died. This is a war, again, with the lowest ratio of civilian deaths ever in all of human history. And yet, it's the one where we accuse them of genocide. So my view is, nobody actually honestly believes in the genocide story. It's a cover for the hatred of Israel and for the fact that they want it destroyed. By the way, I didn't mention anti-Semitism in the talk, but I probably should have. Why do they hate Jews so much? By the way, because Jews are very similar to Israelis. What is characteristic of American Jews in particular? They're successful, relatively wealthy, they've done well. Well, they must be bad. They're the exploiters. So they're consistent. Give them that. I'll give them that. Now, the second part of the question was, one word.
In the East, a lot of those countries have.
Yes, yes. How do you actually? Okay, see, it's the two questions are related in a real way. How did the East become so successful? How did Southeast Asia become so successful? And the key there to understanding that is Japan, because Japan is the real miracle, right? Japan in 1945 was decimated. There was nothing there. The United States had flattened the country completely. I mean, we all know about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States firebombed every single city in Japan except Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They left those for the atomic bombs. But Tokyo was firebombed. Well over 100,000 civilians died. Well over 1 million people were homeless because of the United States bombing of Tokyo. And that is true of almost every city in Japan. And then you take this country that's completely devastated and look what it's become. I mean, if you've ever been to Japan, you know it's like a Western country. It's incredibly successful, wealthy, skyscrapers, vibrant economy, vibrant commerce. And by the way, they don't hate us. If you go there as an American, they're very cool with Americans. They like Americans. And Japan is a major friend of the United States. Now, how did that happen? How did they become so successful? And I would argue that it's because we devastated them. Japan had a really bad ideology, a really bad set of ideas, similar to Hamas, similar to the Nazis, similar to Putin, I don't know, all the bad guys you can add up, right? An idea that they were superior to everybody else, an idea that it was okay for them to die for some greater cause, and that's why they had a lot of suicide bombers, right? The Islamists didn't invent suicide bombings. The Japanese were doing kamikaze pilots before that. They believed in their superiority and that they would achieve all these great things. And then they got crushed. And what happened? They went, we screwed up. Our ideology maybe is not that great. Maybe we messed up. Maybe we were wrong. Then, the United States did one more thing in addition to crushing them. They wrote them a constitution. So, MacArthur, who was the general in charge of Japan after the war, sat down with an assistant over the weekend and wrote a constitution. It is the only constitution in the world that has the phrase inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which we have in our Declaration of Independence, but not in the Constitution. They have it in their Constitution because MacArthur put it in there. Basically, MacArthur put a whole American framework into the Japanese Constitution, then took it to the Japanese emperor and said, "You're going to sign this." He didn't ask. They got an American-like constitution that encouraged capitalism, individualism, progress, and Western ideas. But they were only open to that because they were crushed. Think about the difference of what we did in Iraq. When we went into Iraq, we won. We didn't crush them, but we won. And then we brought all the tribal leaders together in Iraq and said, write a constitution. We'll embrace whatever you guys decide. So they wrote a pretty bad constitution based on all the old ideas that got them in trouble in the first place. In World War II, at the end of World War II, we didn't allow for that. We crammed the Constitution down their throat. We basically did the same thing in Germany, although Germany was easier because they had a certain tradition that came from before the Nazis. But we crushed them. So the Germans, at the end of the war, weren't thinking, if the Nazis had just done this, or they just done that, maybe we still could have won. No, they were flattened. Dresden was in Berlin. All those cities there was nothing left. They understood without any question that they had lost. And as a consequence, they were willing to shift ideologically to something different. And when Japan succeeded, the rest of the Asian countries looked at Japan and said, whoa, how did that happen? And South Korea and Taiwan were both dictatorships. And they were poor. South Korea was poorer than North Korea at the end of the Korean War. And it was still poorer in the 60s and 70s. And then they looked at Japan and they said, something's going on. We're lagging behind. And they shifted and they mimicked Japan. And the same thing happened in Taiwan. Taiwan was also ruled by a dictator. And they also looked at Hong Kong was also incredibly successful because of capitalism. So they pivoted because they had this model and because they had seen what happened to Japan before. And Japan pivoted because they had been crushed. Now, how does that apply to the Middle East? It applies. People don't tend to change their mind in deep, significant ways as long as they think they can be successful, as long as they believe they can win in the end. Like, defeating Germany in World War I wasn't enough. They thought they could have won that, so they went for it again. Hamas today thinks they could still win. And by the way, the student protesters in the United States help them believe that, because they believe that the pressure from the US will ultimately destroy Israel, the pressure by these students. Hamas believes they can still win, and therefore they'll still be around, and the population will still support them, still very popular among Palestinians, Hamas is, in spite of all the so-called genocide. They still support them because they haven't been crushed. So if you want to know how do you change the minds of the Palestinians, how do you make them Japan? You have to make them Japan. I don't think you need atomic bombs for that, but you need to do a lot more than Israel's done. And think about the fact that Israel has run the fewest civilian casualties in all of human history, and they still get blamed for genocide. If they waged a war like I think they should wage a war, oh my God, these people would freak out. Because you can't win without actually destroying the enemy. And that means a lot of people have to die. There's just no way around it. And it's their fault, because they started it. And this is the kind of life, world, of physical force that they want, that they're dedicated to. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Carter Berry. I'm a junior here in the Lyceum Scholars Program. Sorry, Thad. To go back to the question of religion earlier.
That's good.
You said in your argument that every step that was made essentially was a forward progress, society moving towards what's good, was a step away from religion. Is that a proper characterization?
Yes.
So, I mean, if you're arguing that in the end the good of society is moving away from God, and that it's elevating our reason, But if you remove God from that equation, I mean, there's a reason that it is the Christian society that produce enlightenment, because it's a Christian God which endows them with reason. Reason is good in a Christian. I mean, within the Bible, it is taught that not only are humans made in the image of God, they are endowed with reason, essentially. And if these ideas are what are coming from the Christian Bible, that teach us that reason is not only, well, it's fallible, that it's reason that's good, it's reason that can lead to these good things, whereas from even a new atheist viewpoint, these things are still accidents. I mean, human consciousness and human reason are nothing but an accident of evolution.
Yep. Yeah.
And it can't explain that.
Yeah.
You know, what makes reason infallible, or an agent of good from an atheist perspective, when it's nothing more than an accident? Whereas from a Christian perspective, reason is a step towards good because it's been endowed as a good thing from God, as a human being made in the image of God, and therefore it is a good thing.
So, we can get into a very long theological debate about whether Christianity is pro-reason. I'll just give you this one stat, which I find really fascinating, right? From the rise, from really the rise of Christianity as the dominant cultural force in the West, say 450 AD, 500 AD, I don't know when you want to put it, you put it anyway, until about 1,000 years later. In the West, in the Christian world, no astronomical observations were made. Nobody looked at the stars and tried to figure out what was going on there. For all of human history up until that point, everybody was making astronomical observations. The Mesopotamians were, the Babylonians were, the Greeks and the Romans were. They actually put math to it. They tried to explain it all. And then it stopped. And it started up again when they rediscovered those Greeks and when Christianity was fading a little bit in terms of its power. And then you get Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo and then a huge role for 1,000 years. There's no advancements in medicine. There's no advancements in science. There's no advancements in math. There's no advancement in any of those areas where you think reason. Because reason is rejected for those 1,000 years in the history where Christianity dominated everything. And indeed, you say Christianity is the origin of reason. But indeed, during that period, or at least a portion of that period, it was in the Muslim world, where in India, where real innovations were being made in mathematics, in astronomy, in medicine. If you wanted to know anything about medicine in the 1100s, you didn't go to Europe. You went to Persia, or you went to India, or you went to Baghdad, or you went to Spain, where the Muslims were in control. So the Muslims had a golden era. They had a scientific era. They had not quite an enlightenment, but they had a kind of a renaissance. And what drove why did Islam generate scientists? Because they did the same thing that Christians did a few hundred years later. They started reading the Greeks. So if you want to know the origin of reason, the origin of science, the origin of Western thought, it's not in Christianity. It's not in the New Testament. It's in Aristotle. It's in Plato. It's in the Greeks debating and discussing and trying to figure out how the world works and writing about it and observing and writing whole treatises about explaining, I mean, often wrong, right? How the human body works, how the stars work, how all these things work, because they're trying to figure it out. So I think that Christianity adopts reason really when it rediscovers Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas. I don't think it's inherent in Christianity at all. I think it's inherent in Greek ideas. And then it's reinterpreted to be included in Christianity because Christianity wants all the good stuff to be part of it. But it's not inherent in Christianity, this idea of reason. And where does reason come from? Reason is a faculty that we have as human beings. I have no problem as an atheist to understand reason or describe reason or figure out reason. Whether you consider evolution an accident or non-accident, who cares? It's what we have. We have this faculty, biologically embedded. That's all you need. So, the history doesn't suggest Christianity's favorable view of reason. If you read St. Augustine, I don't think you come away from it with a positive view of science and reason in discovery and investigation. I think quite the opposite. Yes.
Dr. Brook, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm Ava, I'm a freshman, and I was just wondering, if Hamas and Palestine are fundamentally evil in their belief system, both in teaching, speech, and in practice, what do you think has led liberal and leftist ideologies to take such a pro-Palestinian stance on the conflict in the Middle East, even despite all of the visible, accessible documentation of October 7th that has allowed and permitted anti-Semitism in a society, especially one that promotes such tolerance as preached by?
And again, I very much think it's this ideology of egalitarianism that they hold. It's this ideology that says that if you're successful and good and done well, then you must be an exploiter, you must be out. Think of this anti-colonialism perspective that they hold, right? I mean, there's nothing colonial about Israel, but the idea of anti-colonialism is, again, this idea of, you know, if you have values that are Western and you bring them to a place like the East, that's bad. That's wrong. So they're egalitarian, they're anti-Western, they're anti-reason individualism, and they are pro this idea that all cultures are equal, even the barbaric ones. All cultures are the same. You know, at some places, if I say the barbaric cultures, you know, I would get canceled. I've been canceled because for saying that. But the reality is, some cultures are pro-life and some cultures are not. Cultures that are pro-life are good. Cultures that are, they can't even make those judgments anymore because everything is the same. Egalitarianism demands that they treat everybody the same. And then they rationalize everything. So if you go to a Gay for Palestine guy and you say, you know, they throw you off a building in Palestine, he goes, I know. But they have that point of view because they're oppressed. If they were free, if Israel somehow disappeared, the Palestinians would love gays. Which is bizarre, right? Because the Afghans are free and they don't like, you know, Jews are not in Afghanistan oppressing them. But they hold these ideas, which are bizarre and weird, but it all derives from an egalitarian perspective on the world, which rejects success and ability. Yeah, so something, yeah. Yeah.
See myself to the rest of the group here, but oh yeah, I'm also a Lyceum sophomore, by the way. So I have two questions. The second one's wildly disconnected from the topic today, but I guess my first question is more relatable, so I'll start with that. So as far as action items go, in terms of resolving this conflict, what would you say are like the most pertinent action items? Because you see in common discourse the idea of delivering aid to whether it be Palestine or Israel in the form of what ultimately boils down to government taxation. Would you not argue that that form of aid or distribution of aid funneling through taxation would just be another infringement on the rights of the individual? So in a sense, would you not argue that you're fighting this, I guess, this repression of individual rights taking place in Palestine with another form of individual or subjugation of rights in the form of taxation, which I think you would define as an theft?
Yeah. So, in a world, in an ideal world where you know, taxation didn't exist, and or the government was funded in some voluntary manner, and we were only taxing a very, very tiny bit that only funded the things that were secure, then yeah, I would be against the United States using tax money to help Israel or to help any ally, unless it was a direct threat or direct fight of the American people, right? But we don't live in a world like that. We live in a world in which the government is taxing all of us $1 gazillion for all kinds of things that they do. And in the hierarchy of all the things that the United States government does is supporting Israel, and you can add Ukraine to that, is supporting Israel and Ukraine relatively good or relatively bad as compared to, I don't know, funding the FDA. I'll take supporting Ukraine and supporting Israel over funding the FDA any day. And funding the gazillion other regulatory agencies that oppress us and restrict our freedoms and restrict our rights, right? At least there we're fighting evil, and we're fighting people who actually want to hurt us. And here we're just inhibiting Americans from doing what they do. So in an ideal state, yeah, I mean, I don't think Israel needs American help. All it needs is for the United States to sell it weapons. Israel's a rich enough country that it can buy its own weapons. It doesn't need, and shouldn't get welfare from the United States generally. But if all the issues, again, all the things we are taxed for, which the government takes our money for and spends, I consider these to be, first of all, amounts that are relatively small in the big picture, and less oppressive of our liberties than much of what the rest of the government does.
Okay, and I guess I'll just start or continue with my second question.
Yeah.
Which has kind of very loose relation to what you said. You mentioned the term intersectionality.
Yes.
You kind of put a negative spin on it. I've always thought that intersectionality is actually pro-individual when taken to its logical conclusion, because essentially what you're arguing is that every individual has their own set of unique experiences that affect their life in some sort of way. But I think the true issue with intersectionality is that progressives tend to not take it to its logical conclusion and stop halfway once you get to groups that are based on race or religion or sexual orientation, but they're not willing to take it to its logical conclusion, that being the individual. Would you not agree?
I mean, I agree with that, but you have to think about what the purpose of intersectionality is. Like, let's take it to a logical conclusion. Let's say you're some mixture racially, some mixture, I don't know, in every other realm, and there are all kinds of things that are, but the whole way in which they're looking at that is, are you oppressed or are you not oppressed? And you're oppressed by definition, for example, if you're not white. You're oppressed by definition if you're not male. So their starting point and the way they look at every set of relationships and all the intersections of who you are as an individual is through a lens of oppression or non-oppression. Oppression or the oppressed or the oppressor. So if you're white, if you have a little bit of white in you, you're the oppressor immediately. If you're successful financially, you're oppressor. So even if you boil that down to individual, let's say you get an intersectionality score and every individual gets an intersectionality score. What is the purpose of that? The purpose of that is to rank you as an oppressor or an oppressed. And that is a horrible way to look at reality. So you're right in the sense that if you take them to a logical conclusion, it's about the individual, but it's still about whether this individual is being oppressed or not oppressed. And that's just the wrong way to think about who we are. Yes, we're all different and we all have different relationships, but that's irrelevant to the question of oppression or non-oppression, particularly in a free society. So think about what they're trying to achieve with intersectionality, not just the mechanism by which they approach it.
One last question.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here. My name is Walter Green. I'm a junior scholar. I was going to ask at first how it was that you believed that the Ivy League schools squared their progressivism with, backing an institution or an organization like Hamas. You touched on that already. What I am also curious to hear you talk about is, anyone who's been in the class with me has heard me talk about my disdain for the Ivy League academics. I'm curious where it is, what your take is on how that came to be in the first place, but more importantly, how you get rid of it. I mean, you hear people say all the time, we've got to root it out. But it seems that in every admissions office in America now, the ideology is there. How do you get rid of it?
Yeah, and it's not like there's a clear version of what should replace it, right? A lot of people want to get rid of it, but what they want to replace it with is either unclear or arguably, bad as well, right? But so let's start with how we got here. And I think it's a long process. I don't think this started yesterday. And I think generally this probably started over 100 years ago. I think if you were a wealthy American 100 years ago, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and you wanted your kids to get the best education possible, where did you send them? Well, you sent the kids to Berlin or to Paris, where they studied continental philosophy, continental ideas that were very antagonistic to the ideas of America, to the ideas of the founding. They studied, the string of German philosophers and French philosophers that despised much of what America stood for. And they came back with those ideas. And some of them were intellectuals. So some of them went to graduate school and got PhDs and went to the best schools because they were smart and they were rich. So part of it is we exported our education to those countries. And then what happened is the best universities in America wanted to become world class. They wanted to be the best in the world. So what did they do? How do you become, if you're Harvard or Yale or Princeton, how do you become one of the best universities in the world? Well, you find the best scholars in the world. Where are the best scholars in the world? They're in Germany and France, and they're continental scholars. Those were considered the best. And you bring them to America. And what do they come and teach here? The antithesis of the principles on which this country was built. They bring what was called in those days the progressive movement. The progressive movement is a European German movement of immigrants who came to the United States with those ideas. You want a group of immigrants that have really done damage to America? It's 19th century Germans. Because they brought those ideas with them. And they went to universities. And they became professors. And then some of them were hired as professors. And they kind of solidified these progressive ideas. Now, they weren't progressive. They were neo-Marxist, neo-Kantian. There were all kinds of things that they brought in. But those ideas have then morphed. And then after World War II, we got a whole bunch of, postmoderns. And very few of these ideas were invented in America. Most of them have been imported from Europe. We have a few that we produced ourselves, but many of them came from Europe. And those ideas in the 40s and 50s and 60s got really embedded. And then you had the student rebellion in the 60s. And those students who were out in the streets demonstrated, the hippies of the 60s, became the professors of the 80s. And they've just institutionalized themselves, particularly at the best universities. It's an ideological struggle. So it's not like the progressive left today invented something completely new out of nowhere that they just made up. They are direct descendants of a long line of philosophers starting really with Plato, but certainly going back to the German Romantics and to Rousseau. I'd say those are the real villains of history. And they are just playing out that sequence of ideas. And the ideas went bankrupt, and that's why the postmodernists were post, right? They wanted to, they shattered it all into complete subjectivism, but that was the inevitable consequence of the Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Marx, Nietzsche. It was where you were heading. There was no way really around that unless you pushed back ideologically. And the reality is, there was no pushback. There was no real pushback against continental philosophy. So ideas drive history. What we're seeing today in Ivy Leagues is a manifestation of 150, 200 years of ideas. That's all. How do you combat it? With better ideas. How do you get rid of them? By offering better ideas. It's your job, right? By ultimately getting PhDs and getting positions, and instead of replacing them, instead of changing them, replace them. I think Dr. Thompson here declared today, I think officially, publicly, unequivocally, that Clemson is the new Harvard. Harvard is no longer an Ivy League institution. The real Ivy League institution is Clemson. That's what you do. You basically let them rot in the rot that they have, let them decline, and build and create institutions that are better. But to do that, you have to have the right ideas. You have to have good ideas. And one of the things that is so essential today is America is a phenomenal country, and it survived 250 years, and with all the progressives and the rot of Harvard and everything, we do pretty well. Life's pretty good in America, in spite of all the negativity. It's amazing here. So maybe we should look at the founding of this country for some clues about good ideas. Maybe there's something there about good ideas. And maybe if we took those good ideas and made them at the forefront of everything that we do in these new institutions that replace Harvard and Yale, that is the future. That's how we get rid of them. We replace them with better ideas.
Absolutely. Let me just say, in partial response to what you just said, I can tell you all that in the last month, I've taken at least 5 phone calls from professors and administrators at other universities who want to copy what we're doing here in the Lyceum program. I had one director of a similar kind of institute at the University of Tennessee tell me recently that he, quote, wanted to rip off the Lyceum program for the University of Tennessee.
One last comment?
Yeah.
So if anything I said was interesting, or you found interesting and you'd like to dig a little deeper, I know you already do this to some extent as part of the Lyceum program, but read Ayn Rand. Read Ayn Rand. And yeah, check out my podcast.
Yeah. Let me just end by saying that I'm really proud of all of you. And I'm particularly proud of the people who asked really hard questions. That's what I wanted more than anything, is for all of you to put him on the spot and drill him hard. And you did. You asked really smart, thoughtful, articulate questions. I've seen the Q&As of a lot of his lectures at universities, and your questions were way better than the questions that he gets at all universities that I've seen. So kudos to all of you, well done, and then if you'd all join me in